welcome back to Equity Tutors. Today's lesson we are going to carry on with the topic of ecosystems that Amelia introduced last week, and today we're going to take more of a deep look at the different consumers and producers within a ecosystem, the different trophic levels, biomass, and also look at percentage yield and how farmers can adjust this. So first of all, we're going to talk about the primary producers, and these are at the bottom of the food chain or the food pyramid. So we are going to work our way up from the bottom to the top and talk about the transfer of biomass and energy between these different levels. So let's start off by looking at primary producers. So primary producers are what every ecosystem is dependent on. So every ecosystem depends on primary producers to produce the energy that is then passed on through the rest of the ecosystem. So a primary producer can also be called an autotroph because they produce their own energy, and this can be done mainly either through photosynthesis, which plants do. So in most of our ecosystems you will see that this is done via plants or via algae in shallow waters. But in deep parts of the ocean where the light can't penetrate, the autotrophs in this system are usually chemosynthetic bacteria, and they use chemicals that come out of the thermal vents to produce energy in the absence of sunlight. So it can be either photosynthesis or chemosynthesis that produces the energy from either chemical or light energy. So this is the first step in the food chain, and this is where the energy enters into the ecosystem. So every ecosystem must have producers, and these are normally green plants, so things like trees, grass, flowering plants, or it can be other things like algae or these chemosynthetic bacteria. So as you know from the previous model, for photosynthesis to occur there needs to be CO2 and water, and in a terrestrial, so that means a land-based ecosystem, plants will use carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to undergo photosynthesis, and in an aquatic environment, so in water, plants will use the CO2 that's dissolved in the water in order to undergo photosynthesis. So as we spoke about before, photosynthesis transforms the light energy into chemical energy, and this is then stored in the plants as different biological molecules. So we're going to go into a bit more detail on that. So as we spoke about, photosynthesis is the process where the light energy is converted into chemical energy, and then the products of photosynthesis are then used by the plant to undergo respiration. So I covered photosynthesis in my lesson, so make sure you go back and make sure you understand that fully. And then Amelia went over the process of respiration. So both of those things happen in plants. They don't just photosynthesize, they photosynthesize and use the products from that to undergo respiration. Other organisms further up the food chain just use respiration, so they can't undergo this photosynthesis. Most of the sugars that are formed during photosynthesis are then used by the plant to undergo respiration. So things like glucose are used in respiration to release energy for growth of the plant. But some of the sugars that are not used during respiration will be used in the plant to make other biological molecules. So these are things like lipids for long-term storage, which allows the plant to survive when there isn't as much light for photosynthesis. Can also be used to make proteins, and another complex carbohydrate that it can form is cellulose, which is a structural component of the plant cell wall. Again, go back and look at the lessons on plant cell structure. And finally, it can produce starch, which is a complex carbohydrate molecule which is made up of many different glucose molecules. This can be used as a short-term energy storage. So when we eat plants like rice, we have starch in there, and that's what we are eating that plant for. So all these storage molecules make up the biomass of the plant, and we are going to go into more on what biomass is later in the lesson. But one way to think of biomass is to think of it as the mass of living material that is within the plant. So it's all of the chemical energy that is stored that hasn't been used for respiration, that is the biomass of the plant. But again, we're going to go into more on that a little bit later. So I've covered so far what a producer is, and they are the first level of the food chain. And we are now going to go on to look at consumers. So as we just looked at, the first part of the food chain at the base is the producers, or the autotrophs, which produce their own energy. Then above those we have consumers, and there's different levels of consumers. So as we go up the food chain, we call each level a trophic level. So the best way to understand this is to go and have a look at the pictures, but the first level are producers. Then we have things that eat those producers. So these are either herbivores or omnivores, so they have to be eating plants because they're going to eat the plant that they're going to get the energy from. They may also eat other organisms, so they may eat other animals, and that would make them an omnivore. But the primary consumer is either a herbivore or an omnivore, and they eat the plants. You then have, so that's a primary consumer. You then have a secondary consumer, and these feed on the primary consumers. So these are either omnivores or carnivores, and this is a type of predator because it predates on the animal in the lower trophic level. Now, above this, we can go further and further up. In some ecosystems, you might have 10 different trophic levels, and each predator will eat the thing in the lower trophic level. So the top predator in any ecosystem is called the apex predator, and this is the top of the food chain. So at that point, nothing eats that animal. The way the energy is then transferred back to the ecosystem is through decomposition of that animal once it dies. So Amelia spoke about that last week, and I touched it in the nutrient cycle lesson on how decomposers are a really important part of the ecosystem. So I've been talking a bit about food chain. So a food chain is where we have just one organism at each trophic level, but actually most ecosystems are much more complex than that, and they are actually more like food webs. So a food web is where things are more interconnected. For example, you might have multiple things that eat one predator, and you might have multiple things that eat the producer, and things can be on different trophic levels as well. For example, a squirrel could eat grass, and it would be on the second trophic level because it is eating the producer, so that is the second trophic level. It could also eat grasshoppers, which themselves eat the plant, so that would make them on the third trophic level. Additionally, the squirrel could be eaten by something higher up the food chain, such as a eagle, for example. So you can see that different animals can be at different levels within the food web at the same time. So, ecosystems are not as simple as a simple chain, and there is quite a lot of complexity on where things go and how they interact with each other. And this is why it's so important that we do not interrupt these ecosystems, because small changes can have a massive effect on the whole ecosystem. If we just, alter the population of one of the consumers within the food chain, that can really affect the whole ecosystem. When we are describing animals that are in the food web, we can describe them using their trophic level. So we can say that they're on the second trophic level, the third or the fourth trophic level, and we can also describe them as what kind of consumer they are. So they can be a primary consumer, and those are things that eat the producer. We then have secondary consumer, which eat the thing that eats the producer, and a tertiary consumer, which eats the thing that eats the thing that eats the plant. So again, it can go up and up, but we can refer to them either as trophic level 2 or primary consumer, trophic level 3 or secondary consumer, and so on and so on. So there are a few different ways we can refer to the different organisms at the different trophic levels. So the next thing I want to talk about is more about the energy transfer through ecosystems. So we're going to be talking about productivity. So as we already spoke about, during photosynthesis, products are made, and some of those are used for respiration in the plant. The other thing that happens is some of them are used for storage. And if you remember very far back into our plants module, you will know that a lot of the light that is available is not used by the plant because it doesn't have an infinite amount of surface area, its leaves are only so big, so it can't absorb all the light that the sun is providing. Only around 1% of the light that actually hits the plant is used in photosynthesis because the majority of it is reflected off or it passes through the leaves and things like that. So the 1% that is absorbed will then be used in photosynthesis. So gross primary production is the amount of energy that is stored in a given area. So this needs to include an energy amount, so this can be joules or kilojoules, and then we also need the volume or the area, so it could be kilojoules per meter squared or joules per cubic centimetre. The other thing we need to know about is gross primary productivity, and this is the amount of chemical energy that is produced from light energy in a given amount of time. So it's just like net primary production, but it is the rate at which it's being done. So if photosynthesizing at a faster rate, it will have a greater gross primary productivity. The next thing we're going to look at is net primary production. Now, we already spoke about the fact that not all the energy that is created in photosynthesis is then stored in the plant. Some of it is used for respiration and is lost through heat and things like that. So net primary production is the amount of chemical energy that is not consumed by respiration. So it's basically the leftover energy that is stored in the plant and is actually available to consumers that consume those plants. So not all the light energy is converted into energy that is available to the higher trophic levels. So we've talked about primary production and net primary production, but we are now going to have a quick talk about what secondary production is. So that is the generation of biomass and energy from higher levels in the food chain. So these are heterotrophic organisms, so they are consumers. They don't produce their own energy. They get their energy from eating other organisms. So as you go higher up the food chain, energy is lost at each stage. So we know that energy cannot be created or destroyed, but at each point you are losing energy through things like respiration and also through things like heat. So the energy that I eat will not be then available for something that eats me. Not all of that energy will still be available because I will have used some of that to do other things like walk and respirate and to keep myself warm. So the energy at every level is lower than the level before. I'm going to go on to a bit more about that in a minute when we talk about biomass. So now we're going to go on and talk about biomass. So you've heard me mention biomass throughout the lesson, but basically biomass is the mass of living material of an organism in a given area. So it's all the chemical energy that is stored within the organism. And this can change over time, so the biomass is given as a measure at any given time. The way that we can think about this is, for example, a tree in the summer will have more biomass than in the winter after it has lost all of its leaves, and in the summer it will then get that biomass back. So we can measure biomass in a few different ways. We can measure the dry mass, which is the mass of an organism after it has had all of the water removed. We can also look at the amount of carbon in a given sample. So this can be done by burning the sample and calculating how much carbon was present. So we're going to go into a little bit more on that in a second. But the important thing to remember is that biomass can be either about one organism or it can be the total biomass in a given area, which could include lots of different organisms. So that could be the trees, the animals and things like that within one given area that could all be added up and be the total biomass in that ecosystem. So as I mentioned before, as we go up the trophic levels, we get a drop in energy and normally a drop in biomass. So normally only around 10% of the energy stored as biomass at one trophic level will actually be passed on and stored as biomass in the next trophic level. So Therefore, the net productivity, as we spoke about before, drops by around a factor of 10 between each trophic level. So you're getting less and less energy transfer per trophic level. So let's quickly talk about how we can actually measure the biomass in a sample, and this is done using calorimetry, and this is where we burn a sample of dry biomass in a piece of equipment that we call a calorimeter, and this burning will cause heating of water, and the amount that the water changes in temperature provides an estimate of the amount of chemical energy that was present in that sample. So, when we look at food packages, we can see how many kilojoules or kilocalories of energy are in it, and this is how they do it. So they burn the dried biomass and they see exactly how much it raises the temperature of a given amount of water. So again, go and have a look at the pictures to see the setup for this, because it's important that you know how this is done for your exams. Going into a bit more detail, the unit of a joule is the amount of energy that is needed to raise the temperature of 0.24 grams of water by 1 degree Celsius. And normally things are measured actually in kilojoules, because that is 1,000 joules, and most things have much more energy than like a few joules in it. So the setup for the calorimeter is that we have to first dry out the sample, so we need to get rid of the water in the sample. So this is done by putting a crucible with the sample in the oven at a very low temperature so that it doesn't burn, but it will just dry it out. So what we do is we previously weigh the crucible, and then over time we take the crucible with the sample out and keep measuring it. And when we stop seeing a reduction in weight, then we know that it has got all of its water removed. So that's when we can then use it, as the sample is then fully dehydrated. We then go on to use the calorimeter, so we have to place the sample in a crucible underneath a volume of water that is in a copper container, and this is done in a system that is insulated so that there's no heat loss. We then burn the sample, and we have a look at a thermometer that is placed in the water. So we then measure how much the given volume of water raises in temperature, and then we can use this to work out the number of joules of energy that were present in the sample. So there are some limitations, and these include it taking a long time to fully dehydrate the sample, and it can also often be hard to get rid of all the water. It can take a lot of time to do that. We also need to exclude all losses of heat from the system. That is not going to, so that all the energy stored in the biomass is going to be used to heat the water. So to do that, we need to have quite complex equipment, and this can be quite expensive. The same with the thermometer. We need a very sensitive thermometer to fully measure these changes. And the more simple that the calorimeter is, the less accurate the estimate will be. So as I said before, we'll be losing heat and things like that. So we can use something called a bomb calorimeter, and that is a very accurate calorimeter where almost all of the heat energy from the sample is used and transferred to the water, but these are quite expensive, so there are some things to consider when you are wanting to accurately measure the amount of biomass in a sample. Okay, so the final thing that we are going to cover today is percentage yields and how this is used in farming. So theoretical yield is the amount of biomass that is theoretically possible to produce in the ideal conditions. So this could be the number of cows that you can grow for meat in a certain area, or the amount of wheat you can produce in a field in a given amount of time. So the theoretical yield is when it is the perfect conditions and you have no losses. This in real life does not happen. So what we actually get is the actual yield. So that is the actual amount of biomass in either crops or livestock that is actually produced, given the conditions that they are under. So what we can calculate from this is the percentage yield. So the percentage yield is the actual yield divided by the theoretical yield times 100. So farmers want to get the highest percentage yield as possible, because ideally they would want the theoretical yield. That's not going to happen, but they want to have as minimal amounts of loss as they can, so that all the money they're putting into feeding the cows is going to translate to having lots of cows, which are then going to produce lots of meat that can be sold. So farming is really interested in increasing the net primary production of crops and also the net production of livestock to get higher yields in the end. So ways that farmers can increase the yield of their crops or livestock are by reducing energy losses, and this can be done either through reducing the loss to other organisms from crops, such as removing pests, so using pesticides, or from reducing the energy expenditure of their livestock. So this is things like reducing their movement and keeping them warm so that they don't lose their energy to keep themselves warm. So I'm now going to just go through an example, because this is going to be something that can come up in your exams as a maths question. So if the maximum theoretical net primary production of corn is 100 kilograms per metre squared per year, then a corn farmer finds that actually the net primary production is only 70 kilograms per metre squared per year. Calculate the percentage yield of the corn and explain why this is not 100%. So what we would have is the percentage yield will be the actual yield divided by the theoretical yield. So the theoretical was 100 and the net was 70, so 70 out of 100 times 100 gives you 70%. So the percentage yield would be 70%. Explain why this is not 100%. So things could have reduced the theoretical yield because the conditions weren't perfect. So maybe there was frost, there wasn't much light that year, there was a lower temperature, maybe there wasn't enough water, things like that. And there could also be another plant that's competing with the corn, or a pest that is draining its energy. So because the crops were not in the perfect condition, there was not a 100% percentage yield. So farmers want to increase their percentage yield as much as possible because they want to make the maximum amount of money possible from any given crop or animal. So they can do this by increasing the efficiency of the energy transfer between the trophic levels, so that we have more energy at the higher levels in order for humans to consume. So again, this can be done by reducing energy that is lost by livestock, and also by reducing energy lost via crops through things like pests. So we can reduce the competition and also pests that would affect the crop. So this can be things like getting rid of caterpillars that eat the corn, and also getting rid of different mice that could eat the corn. So that would then mean there is more energy in the corn in biomass for humans to eat at the end. As I said before, farmers can do this using pesticides. So these can be split up into insecticides, which are chemicals which kill insects that can eat or damage crops, and the other thing that can be used are herbicides, and these kill weeds or unwanted plants that compete with the crop. So this also increases the net primary production of the crop. Another way that this can be done is using biological agents to reduce the number of pests, and this is called biological control. So these are things like you can introduce a different predator for the pests that are affecting your crop. So for example, you could bring in toads, which could eat the caterpillars that are eating your crops, and things like that. And most people will actually use both of these methods to effectively control the losses of their crop so that they get a much higher percentage yield. The other thing we spoke about is doing this with livestock, so things like cows, pigs, chickens, and this is done mainly by reducing their rate of respiration. So this is done through keeping them in pens where they don't have as much movement, so they don't expend as much energy on that. They are kept warm so that they don't have to use their energy to generate body heat. And although this may be good for the farmers because it increases their percentage yield, this is often seen as unethical, as it's not pleasant for the livestock to be kept in cramped and unnatural conditions, so they have a lower quality of life, and although the net production is higher, this might not be best for the animals, and therefore this is not always done this way, because we need to think about how we treat the animals that we are going to eat, as well as maximising their percentage yield. The last thing that I'm going to talk about today is just some maths and how we use the equations in the exams to calculate things like efficiency and productivity. So let's first of all have a look at net productivity of a producer. So the net productivity of a producer is calculated by the gross primary productivity minus respiration losses. So if a farmer is growing wheat and it has a primary production of 20,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year, and when he looks at it, the wheat actually loses 5,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year as heat from respiration. What is the net primary productivity of the wheat? So that would be 20,000 minus 5,000, which would give you 15,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year. So that would be the net primary productivity. That is for a producer. We can then work this out for consumers. So net productivity of a consumer is the chemical energy stored in the ingested food, so that's either of another animal or of the producer, minus the chemical energy lost to the environment through feces and urine, and also the respiration losses to the environment. So in this example, if we have a polar bear that has a net production of 5,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year, and it ingests 12,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year, we can then use the equation that I just said to calculate what its losses are. So this will be the respiration losses and also losses through urination and feces. So that will be 5,000 equals 12,000 minus the losses. So we can rearrange that equation and do 12,000 minus 5,000 to get the total losses, which will be 7,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year, which will be the amount of energy that is lost. And the final thing we're going to look at is how efficient the energy transfer is. So for this equation, we do the chemical energy in the consumer divided by the chemical energy in the food times 100. So this can also be used for the primary producers, so that would be the gross primary productivity divided by the light energy that's falling on the producer times 100. And basically you're looking at the net productivity divided by the amount that the animal has consumed. So for example, if a corn plant receives 5,000 kilojoules per meter squared per year of energy, and its gross primary production is 100 kilojoules per meter squared per year, then we would do 100 divided by 5,000 times 100 to get the efficiency, and that would only be 2% efficient. So that is how efficient the energy is being passed along the trophic levels and between the different organisms in the ecosystem. Okay, so that is all for today. I know that was quite a lot, and there was quite a lot of difficult things to understand and lots of equations, but do go back and re-listen to the lesson, and if you have any questions, then do let us know.
Thank you so much for listening. Remember, you can access additional content on our Patreon page by searching for Equity Tutors, where we have a second 30-minute lesson every week, plus monthly bonus content. You can also find us on most social media platforms. We will keep you updated on new content, and you can find us there by searching for Equity Tutors UK. Please like, share, subscribe and comment wherever you are listening, and if you're enjoying, please leave a review. Bye!
Bye!